brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
All right, guys, so this is our episode 24, and I am going to, and of course, this is our episode 24. We're doing the Scythian World, part 2. And I am going to start with a little opening this time. And so this is going to be a translation of a poem written in 1918. Please keep in mind, this was written in 1918 by Alexander Blok. It's a Russian poet, and it is a very, very famous poem. And as soon as David is done rustling, I'll start. This poem was written kind of in response to political events at that time, so it was almost a little bit over a century ago. But I think it's just as meaningful today, unfortunately. And the poem is called Scythians. There are millions of you. There are swarms and swarms of us. Go on and try to fight us. Yes, we're Scythians. Yes, we're Asians. Barbarians with hungry, slanted eyes. For centuries we, like obedient slaves, held up the shield between two warring worlds, old Europe in the glory of its days, and the Mongolian hordes. You bided time for centuries, staring east, with mercantile, envious desire to strip our land, to come and quell the beasts with your technology and cannon fire. The time has come. Sense the impending doom. Each day our grievances only multiply. And God forbid, but there may be soon no trace left of your comfortable life. Oh, the old world, before you plunge ahead into disaster, spoiled, soft, and brittle. Pause for a moment, as Oedipus once had, before the Sphinx was its eternal riddle. The Sphinx is Russia, in her joy and tears, half drowned in her own black blood. She has been staring, as if into a mirror, into you, both with hatred and with love. To love with such intensity as this, as we can love, you've long since lost those skills. You have forgotten that such love exists, the kind that burns you up, the kind that kills. We love it all, cool mathematical heat, and ecstasy of esoteric visions. We understand both the dry Gaelic wit and the dark German genius. Our memory holds the hell of Paris streets and coolness of Venetian afternoons, the groves of lemon trees that smell so sweet, the majesty of Kern's industrial gloom. And we love flesh. We love its putrid stench. We love its color, texture, and its taste. We're blameless if your bones crack when we clench, you in our tender, powerful embrace. For we're used to having have to deal with wild horses out in the steppes, with bringing spirited stallions to heel, and keeping our slave women folk in check. Turn to us from the horrors of your wars, reach out in peace, and we will embrace each other. Before it is too late, friends, sheath your swords, and we will welcome you. We will become your brothers. And if not, oh well, we have been through worse. We also have learned how to be treacherous. Know this, your late sick progeny will curse your memory throughout all the centuries. Through the fields and the groves of pretty Europe, we will step wide and spread our shoulders out. Keep pushing us, and we will turn to you with our ugly Asiatic march onto Ural Mountains, by all means, where there's a stage prepared for the fight, where life that science breathes into machines is intermingled with Mongolian might. But don't expect to find us waiting there. We will be your shield bearers no more. We'll step aside and see how you will fare, all on your own in this final war. We won't flinch when a ruthless Hun will dig, searching for gold through pockets of the corpses, taking your women, roasting your meat, and filling up your churches with his horses. For the last time, we are urging you to peace. Awaken from your hubris and folly. For the last time, inviting you to a feast. You'll hear the barbarian lyre calling. And that was Alexander Blok. Again, as I said before, he's a Russian poet. He was writing around the time of Russian Revolution. It's 1918 is when this poem was written. Of course, it is very well known in Russia. For a long time, there was even a theory that Russians are direct descendants of the Scythians. But of course, Scythians did not have the slanted Asiatic eyes, almond eyes. Some probably did, as we talked in the last episode. There was quite a bit of admixture and migration. But that is a poem that I think well reflects on the situation, which hasn't changed much since that time. But and that's my own translation, by the way, because I've looked everywhere for a decent translation, and all of them were just completely outdated. So back to our Scythians, and welcome people who are new. And hi, Nathan, how are you doing? So I'm going to roll back so people can see my hat a little bit, which I spent an awful lot of time on doing. This is my Scythian outfit. So of course, this would have been all gold, actual gold on an actual Scythian. This is called the Phrygian Cap. And this is something that Scythians are most often portrayed in. Both Scythians and Amazons are most often portrayed in wearing these kinds of, usually made out of leather. Sometimes I'm going to turn sideways a little bit more so you can see all the designs. And as I have mentioned before, Scythians had affinity for certain prey animals, for example, elk and deer and moose and rams. This is a ram I have over here again. Don't know if you can see the ram on the side of my hat. Fur, a lot of fur, of course. I'm gonna move my camera down just a little bit. I'll have David run the thing, but I did the whole outfit. So they would wear long, what's called a kaftan, with a lot of embroidery, with fur trimmings, because the territory where the Scythians would live would be much cooler territory. Of course, it's in the steppes where the temperature would range wildly and widely from really cool temperatures into really hot temperatures with high impactful wind and very little coverage. Around the outskirts of the steppes, of course, there would be some, how would I put it, some groves and some other areas where you could hide, but mostly firewood, for example, just like it is today in the Mongolian steppes, it's pretty much absent. So wood was considered to be a fairly precious material. On the other hand, a lot of other materials such as precious and other ores were very much available and abundant because, again, we talked about the territory is so wide. So I made this map a little bit about the different spread out of different Scythian tribes. What I did is I took, again, a Russian language map, and I drew where they would be located. This is, of course, the Black Sea. This would be Khersones, the city of Khersones, and I changed into English the names of the tribes as they were known. This is where this right here, the territory would be where the early Slavic tribes would have been. This is Norse Black Sea shore. You can see the dates right here. So, so there's many different Scythian tribes, and we'll talk about them a little bit more, but this is, of course, guessed distribution of the Scythian tribes at this time, and based on reconstruction, based on some information by Herodotus and some information that was derived from other Greek sources. You'll see here the arrow right here that shows Herodotus's journey. So I mean, it is of course not proven, but it's assumed that he had come along those ways with making stops here. This is the territory of the Bosphor kingdom right here in pink. These are different tribes. I mean, best known tribes of the Scythians would be the King Scythians, we will talk about. So there's settled Scythians over here. So some of the Scythian tribes actually were settled, and according to, or near Scythian tribes were settled, which makes sense because nomadic tribes oftentimes do settle on the land. But you see how many different tribes there were, and that's just the ones that Herodotus would have known and written about. I mean, Sarmats or Savramats are the most famous of them all, but we will end King Scythians being the most famous of them all. But there are many other ones. This is another image of. This is Caspian Sea right here, and again I wrote over the existing map. But this is Savramats would have been here. This is Ural. Dahi would have been here. Dakas. Saki Havramar here. So Masages again Isidon. So there was, you can see from these maps that there was just a ridiculous amount of these Scythian tribes, and they were most likely changing nonstop, all the time changing. These are just the list of some of them, and these are territories of different kingdoms. Harizm was being one of the kingdom, of course. You have all the other surrounding Media somewhere on the map, but these was ever shifting, and this is yet another distribution. This is Persia right here. This right here says Persia. So again, this has it marked as Savramats. This has it marked as Scythians, and this has it marked as Saki. Well, the real difference between Saki and Scythians is just one is pronounced by the Greeks, the other one is pronounced by the Persians. You can see that their normal territory, and this is without them going on any sort of conquest quests, their normal territory really stretched quite widely across. This is the map I wanted to show you. So this shows you basically the distribution of those steppe zones throughout our planet, very rough. So in yellow is where you have those herding zones, but you see how big that zone is right here. It really runs from Europe to Siberia. Yeah. And of course, it's paralleled by similar zones in North America and South America, the grazing kind of grasslands. And in Africa, it's not marked for some reason, but I don't know why. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what territory we were talking about. So I want to talk a little bit about life. Well, first of all, what were the Scythians best known for? They were best known for warfare. They were known as fierce and brutal warriors. These are the guys who bothered and constantly conquered Assyria on and off. These are the guys who rolled over various Greek city-states. These are the guys who at one point in time made it all the way to the borders of Egypt and had to be paid off to go away. These are the guys who were seen by the walls of Jerusalem. These guys traveled far and far and far. As a matter of fact, there's some interesting evidence of their conquest when somewhere in the near vicinity of the Caucasian mountains, you will find things like the feet from the imperial Assyrian throne, which, the throne itself was too heavy to pick up and carry it back, but it was decorated with various gold elements. So the Scythians thought it would be kind of cool to just take off those golden elements and take them home with them. So you will find in burials of Scythians somewhere by the Black Sea or, even further, you will find parts that obviously came from Persia, Media, from Assyrian kingdom, from all over the world. So these guys really did work as a mixer for culture. They constantly kept that region agitated in the sense of exchanging ideas, exchanging technologies, exchanging genetics even. So they invented such thing as we talked last time as the composite bow, and I'm gonna let David talk a little bit more about the weapons here in a minute. They were very heavy use of archery. Their famous tactics, of course, and these are the tactics that were later adopted by the Mongols, that were later adopted by the Russian Cossack regiments, and to this days oftentimes used, is the hit and run sort of strategy when you have an overwhelming number of riders, light cavalry at first, who approach the enemy, barrage them with a whole flow of arrows to where it blackens out the sky, and then kind of pretend to retreat and rapidly start retreating to where the enemy army tends to pursue them. And when the enemy army starts pursuing them, they turn around and they shoot again. So each one of these, their horses were not no Arabian horses. They were the short step horses we talked about before, but they were super endurant, super not demanding, I guess, to put it simply. And they were the very first ones to really implement effectively cavalry as such, to actually fight on horseback. Now, of course, there was no stirrups at this time, so all these soldiers in the early times, all these warriors were having to balance somehow on the horseback without flying out of the saddle. And at the same time, they didn't have that ability to put, and a lot of you guys already know that, but for those who might not, when you've got a spear in your hand and you want to run at your enemy, you want to be able to brace yourself against something. Otherwise, the force of the impact is going to knock you out of the saddle. And let me just demonstrate some of the weaponry they would have had. So this is courtesy of Brandon, who is my friend, and he's a smith, and this is an battle axe. In a lot of images, you will see them using this kind of short, very, this is not sharpened terribly, but he kind of made this in a hurry for me. But, they oftentimes would brandish a short, very effective kind of, it's half axe, really half hook, a half beak on the other side, and it's something that is very convenient on horseback to be able to hit your enemies with and actually drag them off the horseback if needed. As far as other weapons, courtesy of my other friend Andrew, we have a very short, light spear. They didn't need a heavy spear. They didn't need a long one. This is a spear that would have been again, they would not be able to use that spear in the same way that later knights would use it, where they would kind of do this, the knights would do this thing where they point the spear at you, right? You don't have that ability to brace. So the way they mostly would use it, but the way you mostly would use it is like this, to throw it, or you would poke people down below you. To where that your height being on the horse would be sufficient to be able to pin your enemies down without losing your own ability to remain on that horse. They're very famous for their swords. We talked about the Akinak swords. Very approximate, again, courtesy of Brandon, very approximate Akinak sword. It's almost a dagger. It's very short. It's very light. It's mostly used really for its point, not so much for slicing, though it can be used for slicing if needed. A very simple, very convenient sword. So something like that. And of course, they would have to be able to defend themselves from various attackers. The shape of the shield that they mostly used was this half-moon shape of the shield, to where you would be able to put your spear through here. And this mine is made out of obviously of a board of wood, but they normally would be light woven with leather over them. No real other complexities on them than, none of those metal bits that are going to go on later, but it could be used single-handed, very easily, attached to the back of the horse. And if you're being attacked, you can easily use it to fight people off, but at the same time, you can use this opening to thrust through with your spear. Now, of course, these guys were feared because with their overwhelming horse riding technologies, nobody could really compete with them. And saddle peoples, when you're up against cavalry and this barrage of arrows, there's nothing much really that infantry can do. They would dissipate in case of danger. Of course, there's the story of Darius, the great Persian ruler who went to conquer the Scythians. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But when the Scythians did not want to go to war, the Scythians did this number, and you can find them nowhere. Darius in particular chased the Scythians across the steppes for a number of days, months, almost a year. And he couldn't catch them. And every time he thought he was almost ready to catch them, they would just disappear everywhere. And there's a story to where he was able to finally corner the great Scythian army to fight him. And two armies were lined up against each other. And then a rabbit ran by, and the Scythian leaders went, "Ooh, rabbit." And they took off after the rabbit. And that was kind of their way of showing Darius their lack of respect for the more organized sort of society. But yeah, Darius chased after them and never found them, never was able to corner them. They're almost impossible to catch. And that also served very well in cases of disease or of plagues, just as it does with Mongolians today, to where in case of an infection, tribes would just dissipate and maximize the distance between the individual members, individual groups, and minimizing the transmission that way. I'm going to stop and see if anybody has anything to say so I can breathe real quick.
I do kind of like the modus operandi of they just dissipate and disappear. I've heard of other cultures that kind of use that technique, but not familiar with it with the Scythians.
Yes, Jake, that is kind of like a Roman short sword. Anybody else, any comments or thoughts? Okay, then David is going to jump in. I'm going to silence so we're not going blah, blah, blah.
Just a couple points on the archery tactics. They, like almost all steppe peoples that would come after them, would not use this pull. They would use this pull, and they would have a thumb ring there. Their arrow would be not on the left side of the bow, but on the right. Their quivers were built into their bow cases, and they could carry like up to a couple hundred arrows. And they would come up and like take 4 or 5 arrows in their bow hand and just rapidly one after another. And a lot of the classical authors remark on how quickly they could shoot. And another thing, those saddles, their saddles were built with 4 little ridges that would later evolve into the four post kind of deal, in like that the Romans and the Persians would eventually adopt. But those little ridges gave them some support. Later, they would pick up longer lances even without stirrups, particularly nobility and stuff. And even very early, you get like bronze scale armor. And that axe, I forget the proper term. Yeah, that pick is made for piercing that kind of armor. Yeah, it's concentrates force in a very narrow place. Other thing I marked here was when Darius invaded, which they say the records say 500,000. There's probably no way that could have been. Probably was not nearly that many, because it would have been hard to support logistically that many.
Troops, yeah.
But he just burnt everything in front of him, and doused, yeah, just took off across the steppe and let him keep coming. And yeah, he finally gave up and went on. But probably after losing considerable people from disease and hunger and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Gotcha.
Yeah, they could. I don't recall which historical report I remember this from, but it stuck in my mind that they could keep 9 arrows in the air at any time. That's how fast they were shooting.
Absolutely.
Absolutely amazing.
Khazars later on also inherited those tactics. And if you guys don't mind, I'm going to actually show you some images from, well, actually, I'm going to wait on this until we finish with the warfare. So scorched earth tactics is what David was just talking about, where they would burn everything out, and that's common in modern warfare. But back then, of course, it was an invasion. It was an invasion, but it was also an invention to where they would burn out all the territories around them, so there would be really no resources for the invading army to really live off. All three members of society were capable of warfare: men, women, children, old people, and as long as they could hold a weapon in their hands, would take up arms. They were known for their, there's a misconception that they practice of scalping your enemies, something that somehow originated in Northern America and the Americas in general. That's not true. Scythians were very well known for scalping their enemies. They oftentimes would count the heads or the scalps of their enemies. They would use those body parts to report to their chieftain regarding how many enemies they have killed, and that way would be able to elevate their social status and to receive their proper praise and their proper payment from their leaders. It's described that they oftentimes would make a hand washing device, something to wash their hands in from human skin. They were known to have made gloves made out of human hands. The drinking cups, of course, are made out of enemies' heads. That's pretty much common practice all around the world. But that kind of a trophy taking was very terrifying, of course, to the more civilized, settled peoples. They had towards the, as the tribes evolved through the progression of time, originally they started out as very lightly armored troops, but towards the end, when you get to Sarmats, for example, they are very heavily armored. Alan Sarmats are considered to be the proto kind of the predecessors, the forerunners, and the inspiration behind the Western knights and their heavy armor. I mean, if we look at the pictures of Sarmats and Savramats later on, they have pretty heavy armor on, and that progression started early on and kind of moved on. I'll show you some images of them here in a minute. They have, like I said, they have conquered as far as Egypt, Palestine, Assyria, Media, Phrygia. Cities were wiped out, Greek city states were wiped out, all kinds of, these guys were going back and forth, and they are reported here, they're reported there, and oftentimes classical sources report them in places they clearly have not been. But they almost like the Cimmerians, for example, Conan the Barbarian is a Cimmerian. The Cimmerians are in particular associated with the afterlife and was the kind of underworld. So sometimes you'll get reports of these warriors in places where they clearly never been, like in the middle of Italy, for example. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has anything to say.
It seems very much the inspiration for Robert Howard's Conan the Barbarian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? So I'm going to show you some pictures from a photo shoot I just did, kind of recreating. My horse is not exactly Scythian, though I would like to thank Mountain Horse for letting me use his wonderful horse. I'm not going to go into the history of its name, but you can kind of get the idea. What we did is because they didn't really have a saddle, but their saddle didn't quite look like that. It had two rolls in the front. It would be a rolled up blanket here, basically rolled up a blanket there. No stirrups, of course. The reins we got as close as possible. We talked last time about the unique types of reins that they had. Their horses would be heavily decorated. This elderly and very kind mare was not as spirited as some of their steeds were, and probably a lot larger, but you get the idea of what they look like on horseback. They were definitely very beautiful, very formidable people. This is what their attire would have looked like. Yeah, and both sexes were dressed the same. It's sometimes hard to tell apart for a female from a male, just because in those steppes, when the weather was cold, it was really hard to not cover up. So to this day, there's pieces of Scythian art where scientists debating is this male, female. So they would have been highly decorated. Whole shoot, everybody, including the horse, who I think were falling down laughing. But see, that's how they would have the shield attached. There's the spear. They would have their doppelaxe, of course. That's me trying to look very, very fierce. Yeah. And this is just for comical relief. This is our Hercules. And this is our bomb Hercules with a big stick. And the reason why Hercules is a part of this conversation is because Hercules was, according to Herodotus, he claimed that the Scythians claimed Hercules as their ancestor and as the father to their first kings. Of course, the Greeks tended to do that everywhere and anywhere that they went. Okay, so I'm stopping to see if there's any comments, suggestions, or anything else. Okay.
No, fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive set of photos there.
Thank you. Thank you.
The earliest signs of Scythian, according to many, was about 3000 BC up in the Altai Mountains. And the reason I mention this in connection with scalping, there are language connections between, what's the name of that group? The one that are connected to the Dene, the Navajo and the Apache.
Yenisei.
Yes.
Say Yenisei.
Yeniseian. And
It's from a river, Yenisei.
yeah, it's their language, same language family. Several tribes up around Alaska are also of that family.
But
So-
outside in the Iranians.
But yeah, so there was some mixture of Siberian peoples in them, but most of Herodotus and other Greeks depict them, and even their own art kind of depicts them as more Europoid. So other thing I was going to mention was the Persian Cataphracts that were they pretty much directly copied the heavy armored noble of the steppe.
I was going to jump in here real quick if get a moment. I've actually heard a lot of discourse about just where the Native American tribes did learn, the scalping thing from, and I've never actually found anybody to really agree about that. So that's kind of an interesting topic.
My suspicion, and of course I'm very, very keen to blame Europeans for a lot of weird stuff. My suspicion is that that ancestral Aryan kind of tribal practice may be somewhere hidden deep within the DNA of their descendants meandered across the centuries into the New World. Because I have heard that the Native Americans did pick up that tradition from the white trappers. That I have heard for a fact.
That is an argument that I've heard. In fact, one person flat out claimed that they learned it from French trappers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's true.
That's what I've heard as well. Right, but the idea of, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a couple more images. These are, I'm going to start out with an image of a bow. This is an actual excavated bow. So you can see how these bows were very kind of unique. The Greeks called it the sigma bow because they kind of copied that letter sigma in Greek alphabet. So these are some artistic recreations of the Scythians, what they might have looked like. This is an Amazon warrior. This is what I was trying to recreate. You can see the very elaborate, she has her bow. She has the same sort of cap with the decorative, I actually copied her coat almost to a T here, her, pants and everything else. It's funny, male Scythians were shown to be wearing something more along the lines of sweatpants, and female ones were wearing something more like tights. It seems that the females preferred tighter, and you can see how their saddles are not really so much saddles as they just covers. Very elaborate quivers. We'll see a little bit more details here. Again, very decorative, very beautiful, very decorative style. Those kinds of hats. Always their bow, always their quiver, a lot of embroidery. A lot of gold, a lot of gold, because their land was very gold rich. This is where I copied my hat from, just for the record. Very kind of same doppelax you see here, which is almost inevitably found in their burials. This is a simpler warrior, but again, you see that kind of unity was of the rider and the horse. You see the same clan symbols, whether it's some sort of a predatory bird. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Elk or deer, again, lots of gold. Okay, so I want to get on to their daily life, unless somebody has anything to jump in with real quick. This vaccine is making me a little bit woozy today, so.
Yeah, there's, I see a lot of traces in their artwork in Vikings.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of similarity.
Absolutely. When we get to discussing goth, not gothism like the gothic music, that I'm sad and I want to die, but goth is the tribe. There's a very fine line between where the Scythians end and where the Goths begin. But then again, the same goes for the Germanic tribes and the Slavic tribes. It seems like these communities, these societies, they intermixed quite a bit and left traces on one another, even weren't direct descendants of one another. So daily life, so what was their daily life like? Of course, everybody who was able physically to ride on horseback or rode on horseback, except very small infants, women who were childbirthing time. I mean, all the way up until it was time for her to deliver her baby. Most women were in the saddle. Of course, the disabled, the elderly, and the slaves, they were transported on carts. They had tents. They were very mobile, and they were able to travel every which way on horseback, following their pasture, but usually they would follow their specific territory throughout the season, and each tribe would have a grazing territory, was winter, summer, etc. locations. And of course, there would be skirmishes around the borders for those lands. They were migrating throughout their territory constantly and constantly engaging their neighbors in warfare. So warfare was very highly valued for both sexes. There are rumors that a Scythian or Sarmatian woman, Roxolani woman, could not get married. until she had killed 6 men at least. And when we will talk about Amazons. I want to do a separate program on the Amazons, but it seems like there's some evidence to suggest that may be true to a certain degree, at least for some women. They used a lot of leather in their clothing. Of course, they didn't have the ability to grow any sort of plants that they could make fabrics out of. So a lot of leather, a lot of felt. Their hats, their coats, everything was made out of felt. And these are the products they would also trade with the settled peoples. They had little pottery, or whatever pottery they had would be pottery obtained from the settled peoples around them, either by trade or by raiding. But they oftentimes would cook within, like Nathan was saying last time, for example, inside an animal's hide. You skin an animal, you put its meat inside its hide or inside its stomach and cook it that way, boil it that way. That's where the expression comes from. I mean, not from this particular culture, but the expression of not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk kind of comes from that, because that was a common practice. When you're a shepherd and you're out in the field and you don't have anything to cook in, the easiest thing to do is to use the animal's own internal parts to make cooking vessel out of. They had their own craftsmen, not as fine, of course, as the settled people's craftsmen, but a lot of their gold pieces and a lot of their iron, a lot of their metal work in general was done by their own smith that had portable craft shops that traveled along. I mean, their wagons in some cases were fairly large to where you could, the group could be migrating and somebody else could be sitting there, knitting or, I don't know, performing some daily duties on a cart or wagon with a cover over them. But they did have their own, basically craftsmen, a lot of gold, a lot of iron. It's a significant use of cauldrons, which will later be seen in Irish folklore. Similar thing, the significance of the cauldron as a magical item. Cauldron in which you can boil your warriors back to life, for example. Cauldron that signifies plenitude. Cauldron as a giant cauldron that is a symbol of the tribe. Cauldron is a very basic, necessary thing to boil your water, etc. Cooking practices, open fire mostly, roasting, boiling in skins, I already mentioned. Very heavy drinkers. When they were introduced, of course, they didn't grow their own grapes, didn't have any opportunity to grow their own grapes because the climate did not really allow for that. But they certainly liked wine, and they were known among the Greeks in particular. Of course, I'm not sure if everyone knows, but Greeks never drank their wine straight. They would always kind of dilute it with water, and it was considered normal practice, 1 part to 10 parts of 1 part of wine, 10 parts of water, sometimes 1 to 5 parts. Scythians like to drink their alcohol straight, would get very drunk very quickly, and there's such an expression as to drink like a Scythian. They heavily used hemp for production of ropes, etc. They also used hemp for spiritual practices, and of course they heavily used soma or haoma, which is believed to be Ephedra today. Like most Aryan peoples that remained in that territory, the memory of this magical substance that was ritualistically important was a very big deal to them. Horses and cattle were their measure of wealth, just like it is in most Indo-Europeans, just like it is in Irish, just about any Indo-European culture you look at, really, number of horses, number of cattle you have is what measures how rich, how wealthy, how worthwhile you are. Feasts played a key part in the bonding of the tribe. So there would be a chieftain, and it would be, of course, his warriors and everyone else, and showing your wealth, showing your good fortune by these elaborate feasts was very important tradition, again inherited by a lot of other Indo-European folks. Tattoos, heavy use of tattoos. Those Scythian burials that are found further in Siberia, they're covered in tattoos, and so very complex, very elaborate, magical and status tattoo system was widely practiced among them. Also, various deformation of the body. Sarmatians later on, do the thing when they deform the skulls of the newborn, and that tradition partially is actually transmitted with the Alans to the European populations. I'm stopping, catching a breath, letting somebody else talk for a second.
That kind of reminded me of, I forget which tribe, but I believe it's a Native American tribe where just because they were traveling around a lot, the head would get a little bit deformed because of that was the only way that you carried your child around.
Right, and a lot of tribes, once they saw that happening, I mean, it's pretty common throughout human history in Africa and, in Siberia, everywhere. Once you see that happens and it doesn't really harm the child, I mean, they would start intentionally binding the heads a certain way to achieve one or another look. And what was considered to be a good look was different for every different tribe and every different culture. But the Sarmatians in particular were known for that. And there's some speculation that they might have had heightened aggression due to heightened headaches because of that, but of course we don't know that. Nathan?
You said they're a very mineral-rich country. Did they mine much, or did they mine anything, and did they trade that way?
Traded a lot. I have not seen any signs that they were mining. I think it was so rich, a lot of it was lying straight on the surface. I mean, of course, now you got to remember these guys did practice slavery when they would raid the local settled villages and towns. Their captives were turned into slaves. I mean, they would be the ones who would be churning the butter. They would be the ones who would be doing the milking of their mares and their cattle. They would be, oftentimes they would cut the hamstrings on their slaves so they couldn't run very far away, or take their eyes out, for example, blind them so they couldn't go anywhere, because a slave doesn't need to see. A slave needs to sit there and be able to do something by feel. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to, in certain areas, use these slaves for those kind of purposes, for example, to obtain gold. But there was no industrial scale obtainment. David wants to jump in on it. And then he wants to contradict me. This is what I know. Go ahead. Kelly.
Oops. You good? All right. Everybody hear me? The Altai region in particular is known for metalwork going back well into the Bronze Age. Also parts of Afghanistan and that region are pretty rich in various metals. And that would be true even when the first Great Turkic Confederation, the Goya Turks, they were renowned as metal workers when they were still under the Avars, they speculate. But anyway, that some of the earliest, they think bronze technology was actually transmitted to China from the steppe. So yeah, there were some miners. Somebody was digging some ore out because they were making a lot of it. And everything from iron weapons to bronze weapons to gold. Yeah, just immense amounts of gold out of the Altai. So yeah, they were doing some mining.
It's actually about, at that point in time, do we know if people were really discovering the advantages of steel versus iron? I mean, were they actually making things out of steel, or was it really just iron?
My understanding is that there were certain, islands of where steel was used, but it was more about, it wasn't a technology that was necessarily widely implemented, and the technology would be discovered here and then kind of lost and then discovered somewhere else. Nathan, did you want to jump in? Was that, you probably know more?
Steel came. The steel came later, and it was oftentimes it was actually steel resulted from iron manufacturing in almost by mistake. Mm-hmm. As far as having a process by which you can intentionally make steel, that came much later.
And from what I understand, was extremely non-uniform when it did happen.
Yeah, very non-uniform.
Not very uniform.
That's kind of why I asked, because I figured that it was probably an accident, but I thought about it because when I was studying Japanese steel technology, tamahagane, if you try to make steel, you make iron. If you try to make iron, you make steel, but you might not know what you have.
Or you have one of each, yeah, a little bit of both.
Yeah, homogeneous steel wasn't until 1860s or something like that, at least in America. No, I'm talking about where you could actually produce steel in mass. Otherwise, it had to be, as Nathan was referring to, a byproduct of ironworking. And while there were, like some of you may have heard of pattern welding, where they would take strands of steel and strands of iron and weave them together to give a sword or whatever more flexibility, but more cutting. And the even steel varies widely on just how much carbon it has. And get too much, you got cast iron. But so.
Well, and the reason why I said that's not true, I know for a fact that there was a culture in Scandinavia that there was a technology that was predated 18 anything, but that was lost and then had to be rediscovered by a local Scandinavian artisan or, master. But anyway, so to finish on our daily life of our Scythians real quick, another interesting thing, of course, was hunting. As I mentioned, was a big deal for the Scythians. They used extensively all kinds of birds of prey, not just your usual hawks and eagles, but they would use even, carrion birds as birds of prey. The art of rearing these birds of prey, or even better, they thought it would be better to catch a wild grown bird of prey and to tame it. It was considered to be that the bird that was brought up in the wild would be more acutely aware of its surroundings, a better hunter, but they, every kind of bird of prey. And another interesting thing that the Scythians had is they had, of course, they tamed leopards, snow leopards, as well as any other large feline creatures they came across, but it was the snow leopards. They would, and leopards, they would raise them since they were cubs, and they would actually have special saddles where the leopard could ride with them when they go hunting. And when they would arrive at their destination, the cat would jump off and pursue its prey. And when it was done, it would jump back up on the saddle with its owner. So quite a unique relationship with those cats. And I just want to finish by talking about the famous Scythian art. Of course, we've all heard about, well, I don't know if we all heard, but Eastern Europe at least heard much about the Scythian gold. Scythians had an overabundance of gold. They also had an overabundance of exposure to other people's art styles, anything from the Assyrian art to the Greek art. So what they came up with was their own unique blend that is called the Animalistic Scythian style. And I just want to show you some images of that because it is very unique, and you can always tell a Scythian work of art right away. I mean, first of all, because it's heavily covered in gold. So I showed this picture before when we were talking about the Scythian triad, but you see they used a lot of felines, occasionally some canines, mainly wolves. Usually it's an image of a predator of some kinds, tearing up some sort of a prey animal. Well, you see the same shield as I was showing you earlier. You see how they're wearing armor that we talked about. There's this, in this case, he's another thing that was really popular among the Scythians. I think that's because they raided the Greeks a lot and took it away from the Greeks. You know those helmets that Patroclus is wearing? Not Patroclus. Help me out, the father of Athens, Nathan. Is it Patroclus, or am I just having a brain freeze? No. Athens, their leader, elected, died of plague.
Patroclus?
Okay, so that was right. But anyway, so those helmets, the ones that, but they wear them like Athena does, kind of kicked back on the back of their head, like some gangsters wear their baseball caps. But anyway, so, but you see that they're already starting to use armor. That's some images of the swords, of what their swords would have looked like. And these are the bits we talked about last time a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. These are some images that, some of the doppelaxes. This is a more obviously elaborate one. This is Sarmatian, most likely armor later on. Doppelax, an early one, a curved one. This is a reconstruction person who is wearing armor. They're wearing this Phrygian cap, but this is later probably Sarmatian. Bunch of Akinox. The name for these swords is Akinox. So this is bronze, this is iron, bronze, and this is iron and gold swords. Very short, almost dagger-like. Another image of swords. Actually, out of the ground. This is a reconstructor, obviously working with that kind of a bow shape. And he makes those bows. Actually, this is a guy who makes those goes by the same tactics. There's somewhat double axis. This is a spearhead. One more image of the, what is this, do you know?
That's the arrowheads.
That's arrowheads.
That's the common shape of them. And
Yeah.
the hole was for poison.
And the hole was for whistling?
Poison.
Oh, for poison. Are you sure it wasn't for whistling?
Well, they were noted for their poison too.
And again, last time we talked about how they buried their dead. They didn't live in these kind of settled huts, but they built these kind of huts for their dead, where you would build a house, and then over all of this, they would put a big mound of earth. These are some of the burials. If I believe this is one of the burials of one of the Amazons with a spear.
Didn't you say something about how they were buried with a lot of gold?
Oh yeah, they to this day, even after a kurgan, which is what those burial mounds are called, after it has been completely and utterly robbed, they're still pulling out. Like this lady, for example, this is in one of the burials where there's 4 women buried. 2 of them are considered to be Amazons. This was the older lady there. She was wearing this golden crown, for example. You can see what it looked like in excavation. Well, she was buried was a 14. But you see these images of predators who are tearing up some sort of a prey animal. That is very common, whether it's a horse, it's some sort of a deer. The only mythological creature that they really, again, you see this, in this case, they're eating somebody's head. But in a lot of cases, the only mythological creature they even had was a weird kind of a griffin with a lot of images of deer. Some of the tribes had deer and rams as their totems or as their symbols. This is the long kaftan. A lot of images, of course, of horses. All of these are gold, by the way. Again, another image of a predator and 2 predators in this case tearing each other up. They really like those images of attack and kind of tearing up. That's the same famous Scythian. Oftentimes they used an art style when they would use a part of an animal to represent a whole. So for example, here you just have a hoof, but it represents the whole animal. And sometimes it would be animal within an animal, but there would be all animal parts. Yeah. Another image of tearing up of one animal by another, stunned by gold. And to this day, the black archaeologists on daily basis in Ukraine and Russia and Kazakhstan, are digging up tons of this gold. I'm talking about by like lots of gold, like one kurgan can yield, kilograms and kilograms of gold. Yeah, creatures. Ram griffin. So what the griffin that I'm talking about is it's basically it's an eagle with a ram's horns. Ram horn in general used to be a very kind of cherished symbol among them. They had very elaborate burial practices and a lot of veneration of their ancestors. And they decorated their horses a lot. I don't know how the horses put up with it, but they did with it. But they did. We tried to put some similar decorations on this horse, and this horse didn't even like ribbons on it very much. It was very distraught by the ribbons in its mane. But so what I wanted to say real quick, just about a couple of the different tribes. So Tsakids or Saki is they were divided into smaller tribes, but they were one of the tribes that Saki had were the Haomo Varga, and Haomo Varga, of course, goes back to the word Haomo Varga means to cook, to brew. So we know that way that they usually actually used Haoma or Soma, even to the point where they named their tribes. And by the way, the difference between Iranian-speaking tribes and Indian-speaking tribes, that Indians usually say Soma, and Iranian-speaking tribes usually say Haoma. Related to Ossetians and Alans, of course, the Scythians are. By the way, Alans is another way of pronouncing the word Aryan. It's the same kind of root, it's just a word migration or drift. Ossetians are considered to be direct descendants of the Alans, who are related to the Sarmatians. Sarmatians were unique within the collective of Scythian tribes. Even Sarmatians themselves said that they were not per se Scythians, though their archaeological culture is completely indistinguishable. But Sarmatians were the ones that were most heavily armored and probably had the highest independence for their females. They also were known to practice of single man, single woman sort of marriage arrangement, to where other tribes had various other arrangements. Roxolani, also very famous. Roxolana, what it means is shining Alan or shining Aryan. Remember, the word Aryan means the shining ones. So it's basically saying the shining ones. Let's see, they had very interesting and unique burial practices where they would kind of lay people crisscross on top of each other. So they would bury corpses, and then the next person would then, they would lay them on top this way and then this way. We don't know what that meant, but it was just a unique burial practice. Sarmats lived near Tanais, Volga Valley, large tribes. Their self-name was Tanais, and they considered, like I said, they considered themselves a part. And some of them had different, like I said, some of them had a ram, some of them had a deer. Each tribe had their own totem animal that they venerated. And I think that's about all I have. And I think we're about dead on time today. David, did you have anything else you wanted to do? Okay, any thoughts?
I have a question.
Sure.
Do people that live in that area still call themselves Scythian?
Okay, so it's complicated. People who call themselves Scythians lived in that area up until probably mid-18th century. Whether or not they were Scythians is a whole different subject matter. People in Kazakhstan to this day refer to certain individuals as Scythians. So in that sense, the ghost memory of the people that is alive. Russians oftentimes refer to themselves as Scythians. Russians oftentimes associate themselves with or refer themselves to as Scythians. But Scythians in the Western world oftentimes is identical to the term barbarians. Scythians were considered to be wild, heavy drinkers, kind of uncontrollable. The poem that I read right at the opening of this episode was kind of alluding to that. Oftentimes people who live in those steppes are labeled as the Scythians, as the other ones, the enemy, the barbarians. David wanted to answer that, so I'm going to silence out for a second.
Yeah, there's two layers to that at least. On one hand, you had the Greek and later Roman authors labeled all kinds of peoples Scythians, that if they were remotely close to that region north of the Black Sea, they would, from Goths to Vandals to the Celtic, the Bastarni, who were Celtic speaking, the Scythians themselves, the Saramate, just lots and lots of peoples. And even as these change from Iranian speakers and then to Turkic speakers and then Mongol speakers, these tribes all mixed a lot. And confederations rose up, they fell apart. And so it was a lot of blending going on. And I mean, I just listed some: Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmate, Inzinges, Roxolani, Alans, Huns, Avars, Khazars, Penichings, Uyghurs, Mongols. You know, all these groups over a 2,500-year period would pretty much build on that Scythian tradition. So in a way they're right, but not properly. Yeah, I'm done.
We're not bowing. And not to extend this further, but there's also a huge debate among Russian. I mean, majority of Russian scientists do not agree that Russians are in any way direct descendants of the Scythians. I would argue otherwise, not necessarily genetically. Well, first of all, genetically, just because those two areas connected quite. I mean, they just came into a lot of contact, and so there's a chance that there was some intermixing happening between the two. So there's probably some gene flow, but there's also a lot of cultural flow with all the nomadic cultures, as David has just mentioned. And definitely the Mongolian, later Mongolian, and pre-Mongolian nomads definitely learned a lot of their craft, and a lot of their culture came from those Scythian times that were very ancient indeed. Anyone else with any thoughts, comments, or concerns?
Just a question, and we see what an important role the Dardanelles play in ancient history, and much of that discussion is about controlling the trade route from the Black Sea. And so if that trade was that important, there had to be a lot of trade coming out of the Black Sea.
Yeah.
And so they had to be trading a lot of stuff.
Oh yeah, fur,
So,
various meat products, and of course, gold, various other important ores. Yeah. We have a couple options. We can go back to mainland Greek. We can do Phoenicians, which we really haven't. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not quite ready to do Hebrew history, Jewish history quite yet. That we're going to leave that as a separate. So we could do the Phoenicians. We could do the Greeks. Any other suggestions? Anything else anyone wants to throw out? Which direction you guys want to go from here?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the metallurgy, but that can kind of just poke its way in from a lot of other discussions. So sounds all good to me.
Somewhere we got to stick in China. Somewhere we got to stick in lots of other.
Carthage or just
Well, no, just Phoenicia leads to Carthage. Phoenicia leads to Carthage, and Carthage is kind of its own. Carthage is a gateway into Rome. So
Phoenicia in general, I would like to discuss more, but you know what? There's so many other things to discuss too. So whatever order.
Oh yeah, all of Australia, for example. No. So yeah, let's do the Phoenicians because that's going to be a single episode, and it's a fascinating story of one woman's rebellion against her folk and kin. But yeah, let's do the Phoenicians for sure. Okay, thank you everyone. It was awesome to see you here.
Great cast, everybody. Be well.
Okay, thank you. I can finally get out of this really hot outfit. Okay, bye.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.